Yay. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. Time to talk about super fun things, or at least I think they're super fun, because they are. Yes, it's a fact. So products that feel a bit more human, like products that project a specific personality, tend to connect more strongly and more powerfully with their audience. There's just something about like having this strong message, this strong personality that connects with us emotionally and makes things more memorable. So when we design, or rather align our design decisions to all focus on giving one specific message, conveying one specific personality, we can really differentiate ourselves from our competitors and make something that like sticks in people's minds as like a notable thing. So being expressive with our design, especially when we do it well, which is what we'll be talking about today, means we can make these stronger connections and stick in people's minds, be a bit more memorable. For example, things like TunnelBear, which if you're not familiar with them, they make VPN software. That's the first thing you thought of when you saw a bear. And they take on this personality of a big giant bear, like a really big giant bear, that is protecting you from all of the snoopy, terrible network things that happen to you on the internet. And he is in, I don't even know if the bear has a gender, but the bear is in all the places, all their illustrations, all their copy. He's in all sorts of places, and when the software works, the way they explain it is the bear digs tunnels across the earth to connect you to a safe part of the internet. Really highly technically accurate for how VPN software works, right? I've never made VPN software, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And when you actually use this software on your machine, the bear comes out of a tunnel, because, series of tubes, right? And then jumps into the earth and digs another tunnel for you to use a more safer internet. So this bear is everywhere and really all part of the way they convey their brand and what they do. And he's even animated sometimes. When you're downloading TunnelBear, you can throw fish at the bear. It's pretty fun. So, there's no mention, while this is like VPN security software, it's nothing like many of the other VPN software sites you see out there. Most of those are very like blue and red, or blue and white rather, or red and white, have lots of like shield symbols and have really technical terms. And they're like, no, a bear digs a tunnel through the internet for you. Done. And you're like, okay, bear, I trust you. And one of my favorite things about TunnelBear is, the fact that they do have such a strong personality and character, but there's also, you notice little things about their design. Like, this expressive design is not perfect. There's definitely things they make that might be considered like design mistakes. Personally, I notice the animation a lot, and sometimes it's a little rough around the edges, but you totally don't even care, because the personality they're projecting is so strong and so consistent, you kind of don't worry about those, you don't notice those little details that maybe aren't perfect, which I think makes this like even more effective. You can see the same kind of thing going on in products like MailChimp, if you've ever used them. They've been around for like ages, but they have a chimp named Freddie who comes up and does things for you, like when you're about to send a newsletter. He's like, are you sure? This is a big moment. And you're like, that embodies exactly me over the enter button when I'm sending things. And MailChimp has this personality of being like a really helpful and empowering type of thing, right? Like, they're here to help you get your stuff done, to figure out how to do email marketing and get your newsletters through. Even though that can be a scary thing, they're here to help you, to let you do what you need to do. And Freddie comes up in various different ways. If you are a longtime MailChimp user or familiar with them, like in the early days, Freddie was everywhere. He's on every page. He would tell you jokes. And their personality or the way they've expressed their personality has evolved over the years. Now Freddie's mostly seen in the moments like this where you're sending a thing, or when you're done sending it after that high stress moment, he's like, high five, good job, you did it. And you're like, oh, thank goodness I did. So there's, this personality is still the same, but they changed the way they express it while their audience grew, while, their product grew and had to serve more and different people. Freddie is still there, but just in different ways. And even with their most recent redesign, which is really different than anything they've done before, he's still there up on the top. He's still animated in places, and they've still got that personality expressed in so many different ways over the years. Of course, you don't have to have an animal. Bears and chimps are cool, but you can do this without animals too, in case animals aren't your thing. But really, shouldn't we have more cute animals protecting us from the internet? I don't know, that would be cool. But the things you think of over lunch. But apps like Authentic Weather, which is definitely an app you are never going to confuse for any of your other weather apps, they have this personality of being that kind of brutally honest roommate. Like, I always imagine like one of my roommates in university was like just always like had the most like kind of I don't know, really smart-ass comments on everything that would happen, but they were also really smart, so you're like, oh, you're smart, but you're also kind of mean. And they really, they really embody this disgruntled roommate in like the way they use their color and their copy. It's all very bold, and the things that they write. And they even do things like make fun of you for knowing science and Kelvin. They're like, why would you do that? And everything about the way they project themselves has that kind of, brutally honest roommate that knows things and is super smart, but also is not going to like sugarcoat anything at all. And they do that. No animals, type, color, all of those things. Stripe does something similar. Well, actually, also has personality, but not really in a similar way. Where they're kind of like, if they were embodied a person, they would be like that super sophisticated friend that knows all the complicated ways to move money around with the highest tech stuff, and they're going to make it easy for you to do it too. And they do that a lot through animation, actually, but also through their design, all their design choices, where they're creating this slick, sophisticated feel, but also a sense of ease. And they'll help you get through things like Bitcoin without making it too complicated. They probably even can explain what Bitcoin is. I thought that was going to be funny, but that's okay. There's more where that came from. But all their design choices, the way they do their things, they really stick with that like sophisticated, like slick feel, but also keeping it very friendly. And you can imagine like some of the other payment processing or payment gateway things you use, they kind of come off like banks and they seem very serious and are using like the big technical words, and Stripe stays away from all of that and seeming a bit more friendly while still getting the job done. So, it's not by chance that all of these products stand out from their competitors and the other things like them. They're very expressive, they have their personality, they know what their personality is, they express it throughout their entire design. And the one other thing I think makes these so powerful and that makes them connect so well is the fact that they're very honest, right? The personality they're projecting matches what you, the person using them, think about them. If they were trying to be all serious and, I don't know, important, and you're like, no, you're not that doesn't feel right, but these really fit with what we think of these brands and these products too. So what does it mean to be expressive? And expressive is just really this idea of like conveying a thought or feeling. And in this case, we want to convey a specific thought or feeling with design. And how do we do that if we wanted to do that with design? We can do that with our choices of like type, of color, the words that we use, the copy, the layout, motion, the sound, like all the things we use to design things, we can use to say specific things with our design. And I'm going to talk about the last two things in this list more today because I feel like those are the two that don't really get a lot of attention. They're kind of the ones that maybe you wouldn't even put in this list initially, or you'd just be like, I don't do that stuff. But I think they are really powerful design tools, and if you can do things like type and color and layout, you can totally do things like motion and sound. So let's talk a bit about expressing personality with motion. Like, how do we do that? I think that it's pretty obvious in many ways when we see things in motion that they do they communicate something, right? I mean, I guess technically this whole place we're in is all about that. Motion and animation are used to tell stories, to express feelings, but like, how the heck do they do that? I have a fancy bulleted list that explains exactly how. That's actually true and also a joke. It's one of those ones. So the way we can make our animation say different things, how we can make it come off and express different things and come off differently is through our easing choices. Like, are we going to use an ease in, an ease out, an ease in out, or a bounce or a spring? Are we going to use like the CSS keywords ones or make up our own? Oh my goodness, I don't even know. That's not true. We'll go through those in more detail. The way we have our durations and offsets, like how long does a thing take to move? Like an object moving from like here to there can move very slowly, it could take a long time. It could take not a long time, and it's going to move different speeds. How does it work with the rest of its like other animated elements? We're rarely just moving one thing. How do our offsets work? How do we space between them? So many questions and so many ways to say different things. And then, of course, the properties we animate. There's no like secret rule that like if you animate one property, you have to animate them all. You can make some really interesting, convey some really interesting things and make some really interesting design decisions by deciding like, hey, we only animate this short list of properties, or this one property, or no properties, if that's how you want to go. That's totally a valid option. It's more about deciding and making intentional decisions as opposed to using all the things all the time. So let's dig into this list a little more specifically. How do we use this stuff? Especially that first thing, because the easing curves, like, that is just a giant rabbit hole you can go down. There's like infinite numbers of easing curves out there. How do we use this stuff to express specific things and have control over what it says? Because the one thing about like all of our design decisions, and especially around animation, it's going to say something. Like, something will be conveyed to who is ever viewing the thing that you've made. And we might as well like try to be in control of that and try to guide what it's saying. So let's think about some personality descriptions and see how we can get animation to do those things for us. And I'll start off at one end of the spectrum of being like calm and soft and reassuring. It seems like a good place to begin after lunch. So if we wanted to be calm, soft, and reassuring, and like the kind of personalities that might want to be this are things like maybe like your calm, enlightened meditation coach, or like a yoga instructor, or someone who's going to help you find the perfect relaxing vacation to get away from all the stressful things. Like, there's a lot of different personalities that might want to convey something along these lines. And this is the way I tend to start a lot of motion projects when it comes to questions of like, how does our product move? How does our brand move? And I've done a lot of projects before when I was a consultant, as well as my current job, around like figuring out, what do we want motion to say? How do we get this in our product? How do we get it in our design systems? And this tends to be how I start. I find a list of words that describe the product, of what we want to say, and then start figuring out how to make motion say that with really simple shapes. If you want to be fancy, you can call them motion studies. That's what I do, because it sounds much more hard than it is. So if what I came up with was like, hey, we want to be calm, soft, and reassuring, if that's the area of personality I'm heading for, I would want to use things like opacities, soft blurs, small changes in properties. Deltas just means change in things. So like moving small distances, moving a small amount of color, whatever that might be. And using easing curves with gradual speed changes. Because if you imagine like, if your calm meditation instructor was walking, they're probably not going to like dart all over the place and have sudden starts and stops. Like, that doesn't feel very calm. Don't hire that meditation instructor. So we want to do the opposite and have, you want to have speed changes because otherwise things feel very mechanical, but ones that are very gradual and not alarming. So how that might look on some simple little motion studies, maybe we could do things like fades, little scale and fade. Of course, if you've done that, you got to blur and fade. And then all the things. Or blur, scale, fade, whichever. You can see those again in slow motion to get a slightly closer look. You can kind of get a sense of how these different properties work together to create this sort of like soft around the edges, soft, calm feel to things. And one quick aside about working with blurs, because those are a really great way to get soft things, but blurs, when something is a little bit blurred, it looks very soft. When it's very blurred, it looks kind of really harsh and ugly. So if you're ever using things with blurs, you definitely want to fade that stuff out before it gets ugly. And the way I usually do that is, that's a technical term, fade it out before it gets gross. Write that down for sure. So if you have a blur, sometime before that blur gets gross, you want to have an opacity come in and just be like, don't look at that. So in a timeline view or like a CSS view, that's how I tend to do blur things, how to keep blurs soft, because they can be pretty harsh and ugly. So that's how we might handle the properties in this particular case. But we mentioned already that like easing is a big way we communicate with motion, and we haven't talked about that at all yet. So easing is one of those things, like I said, that we have so many options, like almost infinite number of options, which then brings you to this place of when you need to pick easing, you're like kind of paralyzed by choice, right? It's like starting with that blank Word document or that blank design document of just that big white square being like, put stuff in me, and you're like, I don't know. So there's some ways we can approach easing in a way to avoid that blank document state. We can use some nice kind of pre-made defaults as a starting point for where we could branch off and make our own decisions from. A great place for that is the Penner easing equations. Like CSS and a lot of, I guess, some other tools as well have sort of their own default, like ease in, out, and all of those things. Those are an okay place to start, but I really like the Penner easing equations because there's more of them, and we all know more is better. But more specifically, these were actually designed to look like good motion. They were designed with motion and the appearance of motion in mind, and they actually hark back to the days of Flash, where a developer named Robert Penner came up with these equations, and they've been translated to like just about every language out there, from like CSS to C# over the last few, I guess, decades? Wow, that's a long time. Anyways, Here's a set of what they look like, and there's other thing that's really nice about them is they're all come in sets of 3, right? All of them have an ease in variation, an ease out variation, and an ease in out variation, which means if you want to, you have these nice little groupings that you know are going to look good together. Like that ease in sign is going to look good with the ease out sign, is going to look good with the ease in out sign because they all follow the same math underneath. So the other thing I really like about the Penner easing equations as a place to start for your easing instead of that blank page is that you'll notice that the curves change shape in a very methodical way, right? When we look at our ease and sign in the top left, or just our sine curves right there in the top left, they almost look straight. And these graphs are all plotting the progression of animation against time, the progression of animation against time. And what we're seeing is how the speed changes. Where it's flatter, the rate of change is slower, steeper, the rate of change is faster. And those sine curves are almost flat, right? That's really close to a straight line. So that means very subtle changes in speed, but still noticeably different from linear, which would be that straight line. We move over to the right a little bit, we've got the easing quad, which just curves a little bit more, and each one gets a little bit curvier until we get down to the expo in the bottom right, which basically looks like a slightly wonky hockey stick. Technical term again. But clearly those ones with the ease and expo are going to be much more drastic speed changes than the ease and sign, and we have that whole kind of gradient from one to the other in between. If you want to see them in action, because of course you do, we can kind of get a sense for how those curves look different when they're actually being played out if we compare the same animation with 6 different easings. So if we start with sine, and then we kind of keep going down the severity until we get to expo. And even though this is the same aqua circle with the exact same duration, the only thing that's different is the easing, that last expo version seemed like it was moving a lot faster than the beginning sine one. Because the more complex our easing is, the faster, it just feels like it's going a little bit faster when we have those more drastic speed changes. So if we're going for this calm, soft, and reassuring, as you might guess, we'll stick on that top, kind of flatter, more subtle side of those equations, and maybe pick something like an ease in or the sine curves, maybe use this as a starting point to kind of adjust to what feels best for our brand, or maybe even take these right out of the box. They're open source, you're allowed to do that. If we wanted something a little bit more dramatic, we might go with the ease and quad, just up one level of curviness, and we'll get a little bit more contrast in our speed changes, but nothing too severe. So we'll still have that calm and stable feel with these curves, things that are speed changes that are gradual and slow, but still actually have those speed changes to seem natural. So it's a pretty great place to start. If we wanted to move up our kind of personality scale, I've completely invented this personality scale, but in my scale, the next step up would be this idea of wanting to be confident, stable, and strong, which is very different than wanting to be calm and soft, right? Again, these are words that maybe in your mind, don't bring to mind a lot of motion. They aren't things like darting all around, but there's definitely a different way you would convey confident and stable and strong versus calm and soft. It's a different direction. And if we wanted to do that, some things that would work well would be direct movements, having that confidence, I am going over there, so you go over there, and you look very confident going over there. Movements that are in straight lines. A lot of things in real life don't happen in straight lines, but when things do happen in a straight line, they feel very honed in and very knowing where they're going and very focused. Symmetrical ease in and outs, things that speed up at the same way that they slow down at the end, can create a sense of stability because symmetry, which seems to be a theme over the last few minutes. And also, we want to avoid things like blurs and bounces and overshoots. Blurs would probably make things feel really soft, which isn't necessarily confident. And if something's bouncing around, doesn't really let things seem like it knows where it's going. So to make that happen, we could do things like this. We could have a quicker fade, a different kind of scale and fade, and have these direct movements to exactly where that next place is going to go if it's going to move. There's no overshooting, there's no bouncing, it's just going there. And of course, in slow motion again, scale fade in slow motion is my favorite thing. It's it's going away, but it's not. So even though we were using the same properties in the last example, these do feel different. Part of it is because they have a shorter duration. The quick fade, not just a fancy name, it actually was shorter than the other fade we saw for calm and soft. It was maybe 50 or 100 milliseconds faster, but just enough to make it feel a little bit different. And the easing curves we use there are ones that are a little bit more dramatic, have a bit more of a curve to them. If we move down to like the cubic and quad curves, we get a bit more of a curve to it. Like you notice the easing cubic has that like really flat bit at the beginning, right? So it's like really speeding up as it's going. And then the ease out has a really drastic slowdown or dramatic slowdown before it stops. So we could even go for things like the quad curves as well, or quart curves as well, sorry. Too many things that start with Q in these. It's really my only complaint with them. But these quart ones are one step up from the cubit and just a little bit more curved. Personally, the cubic ones are my favorite, but you are allowed to have your own favorite. It's okay. We'll totally let you do that. So these can be a great place to start when you're going for those sort of personality traits, or even ones to just like use right out of the box. So let's move up in energy levels and maybe look at things that are a bit more like lively, energetic, and friendly. And these start becoming words that we might be more likely to associate with motion. Even though all of these words are words that we can make motion to feel like them, usually when we're talking about things like energy and friendliness, that's when we tend to turn to motion, even though it's not the only time we necessarily have to or can. So in this case, we can kind of go and use some of the stuff that we said wouldn't really work in the last one. We can have overshoots, we can use anticipation, snappier easing curves, curves that have more drastic speed changes. That's going to really change the energy level. And if we're going for a high energy, energetic feel, maybe like the fun friend who always knows which bar you should go to at night or the best places to see in a new city, like that's where you'd want that like kind of peppier, like more darting energy, even if it wouldn't have felt right in some of the other ones we talked about. So to make that happen with some different circles, we can have our overshoots, which is essentially going past where you're going and then like kind of snapping back and being like, whoa, here's where I should be. Of course, we can do that with scale too, which gives us a nice little like elastic feel in a way. And our anticipation is the opposite of our overshoots. And we can, of course, use them together, because once you've used one, why not use the other? It's a good question. So in slow motion, we get that overshoot and scale. And you can kind of get that sense of overshoot much more when it's going slow. And anticipation is a little more obvious in slow motion too, where it goes in the opposite direction before it goes where it's going to go. So overshoots and anticipation are a really great way to change the energy and raise that energy level, give you that energetic feel, no matter what motion you're having, even if it's not just on scales and fades. And we have two ways we can get these overshoots and anticipation. The first way is with our curves. Easing curves are amazing. They can do anything. They'll make you coffee. That's not true. If it was, though, if any of you know an easing curve that can make me coffee, I need to know about that one. But the way these easing curves work, if we are plotting the progression of the animation against time, then the progress one is the up and down one here. If we're going below that 0 point, right, we're going back in our progression or the opposite direction of where we're going. So that's how we can get, in this case, some anticipation in that first one. Anything that sticks out of the bottom, if you're like, I'm using this curve to go from here to there, it's first going to go this way and then go that way, which gives us anticipation. Because time, we can't stop from going forward, but we can mess with our animation progress. It's amazing. Anything that goes out the top is going to give us some overshoot, because in that case, it's going past its destination and then snapping back. And one that goes both under and over will give you the two together. And these are actually the curves that I used in that last example of anticipation and overshoot together, and they're even Penner easing equations. It's amazing, they're everywhere. Of course, that's not the only way you can get anticipation and overshoots. If we wanted to have different overshoots, if these specific back calculations are not the ones that felt right and looked right to us, we could use any of these curves for overshoots. These are all really different, like that first one, barely squeaking over the line. The second one kind of has this weird little lump and then it goes flat. And the other one is more of an actual like arc. And we can do all of these with cubic Beziers depending on which handle we decide to, well, put it where, really. We can create an overshoot with that handle. Can even do it with the other one. So many options. And these will give us a slightly different bit of overshoot, obviously, because of different curves. But there's still like a lot that we can go with in there. Of course, sometimes these curves, sometimes the cubic Bezier overshoots don't give you exactly what you're looking for. They might be close, or maybe they're nowhere near close. This is like the easiest way to get overshoots or anticipation. And if these aren't working out, if you're like, oh, there's just something a little weird with them, or this one's not looking right for me or what I want, we can make our anticipation and our overshoots in slightly different ways. Because the one thing about cubic Beziers that's always true is these handles, like, they are opposing forces in a way, right? Like, they're always going to affect each other, and we can't move those two other points. So sometimes the curve can't get you exactly where you want. So we can use our overshoots, or make our overshoots in a different way. So instead of using the easing curve, we can actually like insert frames into our animation to create our overshoots, right? Because essentially it means going past where you were going and coming back. So instead of saying going from here to there and use easing that pushes you a little past, we can just be like, go here, then there, and then here. So in a typical here to there animation, it might just go like from 0% to 100%. But if we threw a 90% that's a little bit past the 100, we would force that object to move past and then back. So it could be like, actually, go there and then to 100. And then if we played that back, we get a thing like this. And if you use something that's got a little bit more animation fidelity than Keynote, that will even look a lot cooler. But when you're doing it this way, you get a lot more control of how that object moves between 0 and 90%, and then how it goes back to its destination between 90 and 100. So there's a lot more, kind of, for lack of a better word, frame by frame specificity you can have there and get a lot more into how it works if the curves don't get you what you're looking for. So even with overshoots and anticipation, almost endless variety of things. And these overshoots tend to show up in places that you might not really expect. For example, something like Stripe, which is really going for the sophisticated feel, but they also do want to have a touch of friendly. They have just a touch of overshoots in these graphs. When these little dots move out, just that little bit of a soft overshoot. So we can have soft overshoots, we can have severe overshoots, and they're all going to feel very, very different and create energy in different ways. That was Stripe. This is Slack. They do it too. You've probably seen this before. You'll notice that little bit of overshoot on those lines as they go out to that last bit of the hashtag. Or just like, the hash mark. Just a tiny little bit of a scale overshoot. And if you are into CodePen or anything like that, there was a time not so long ago where there was all these like, the Slack loader done in like SVG or done in CSS, and none of them have that easing with that little bit of overshoot. They all get the easing wrong. And now I have ruined every one of those demos for all of you forever. But it is a really interesting thing to me. It's like not a lot of us really look at that easing so specifically, but those small little changes of easing change the overall impression we have of the thing. Like a lot of those demos, you might have seen them and looked at them and been like, that's not quite the Slack loader. It doesn't feel the same because it wasn't using the same easing. So easing, even though it's one of those, it really is one of those kind of very specific design details, but can make such a difference in the overall big picture. So let's do one more level of personality and go for the things that are playful and fun and lighthearted. Yay! I left the yay off. That's just, it's a silent yay usually for most people reading this slide. So if we wanted to do that, if we wanted to go for this even higher energy, this playful feel, this fun, lighthearted feel, we can start pulling out some of the animation tricks that didn't fit so well with the other ones. For example, things like our bounces and shape morphs and squash and stretch. All of these things, especially the squash and stretch, are pretty tough to use without feeling playful. It can be done. I've seen it done occasionally, and it's amazing. But for the most part, when you start going to these places, it's going to start reading as playful and a little bit fun, and kind of have maybe, especially the squash and stretch, even start going into the childish kind of feel, which if that's what you want, perfect. But it's pretty tough to not get that when you're starting to use these. And I'll show you what those look like too. So on our same little circles, let's get a little fancy, do some bouncing. Also a bit of an elastic look. And you'll notice the main difference between those two is the bounce was hitting a thing, and the elastic is just kind of oscillating back and forth, but really similar motion otherwise. And then we can morph, which is the best ever. Anytime you can morph, you should do it. And squash and stretch, which maybe not the best squash and stretch ever, but the basic kind of rules of squash and stretch is your object is going to stretch while it's in motion, so notice that kind of stretch as it went up, and then when it hit its end point or hit the end, it kind of squashed back into position. And sometimes it'll squash even more than it was, and then kind of go back out, so you can get very different amounts of squash and stretch. And that's the one that tends to read as pretty playful. And even getting a little bit childish, but can really also soften the edges of some interfaces otherwise. And all of these things, there's one thing that's very different between these four than the rest of them that I've shown you so far, besides the way that they look. And that's that these particular kinds of effects, you're going to have a lot better luck pulling off with JavaScript than CSS. Because pretty much all of these, well, at least the first two, are both also done with easing curves. And they're done with easing curves that CSS, or specifically cubic Beziers, can't really pull off. So at the moment, CSS works best with cubic Beziers. It's kind of your only easing option. So if you want to get to these types of easing that hit more points, that have more complexity to their easing curves, we generally have to look for a JavaScript solution. When it comes to the morph, generally have to use SVG for that, and JavaScript animation is just a little better supported to make those morphs happen. And our squash and stretch, actually, that one is CSS. Just joking. You can do it with JavaScript too, though, but that particular one, CSS. Can you tell from the circle? It just clearly just said, no, it didn't. You can't tell, but I just told you. So when we're going for these more complex curves, we generally have to go to a JavaScript solution. Greenstock is a JavaScript animation library. It is not the only library that can give you these curves, but it is the one with the coolest easing visualizer, so we're using it for our example. And the curve that I have highlighted right here, right now, is the elastic curve. And if you look at the shape of it, and then remember how we make cubic bezels with just those two handles, there's no possible arrangement of those two handles that can get you this curve that goes both over and under. It's just, and then back up again. It's just not going to happen. That's going to require different kinds of control handles, or more specifically, different math. And JavaScript can use any kind of easing you want it to, so we can get these different kind of more exponential equations in here to make these happen. This even plays to see that elastic. We can see the bounce curve too, which also looks very different. You can see how it's hitting all those different edges. And just to really bring this full circle, the elastic and bounce are also Penner easing equations. They really are everywhere. Actually, most of the things in this list are, at least at the top few, are Penner easing equations. The power 1, 2, 3, and 4 are things like the easen, cubic, sine, cubic, quad, and all of those in order as well. So we see these everywhere, and they can be, like I said, a really great starting point for jumping off and creating your own easing field that you want to have, but not be starting from that blank page. And also, these visualizers for easing are just super fun to play with. So you can get a sense of how easing can change, even a simple movement from top to bottom. Because even this ease visualizer, despite these more complex curves, is still plotting the progress of the animation. They flipped it and did the progress on the bottom against time. And that's what all of these easing graphs are doing. It's just a matter of what kind of speed changes you're going to have, or even direction changes you're going to have across that progression. So lots and lots of power we can have with our easing. So that was a whole lot of time really nerding out about easing curves, which is one of my favorite things to do. So I'm really glad you joined me for this. And it's all things that you can take and use tomorrow well, not tomorrow, you're here tomorrow, but when you actually go back to work. You can do the same things we just did. Start with some descriptive words, the personality, some description of personality you want to project. You can even start from the things that we did here and have these little motion studies with those circles and try to isolate that personality with the easing and timing that you use. And it's one of those things you can just spend a few hours exploring and testing out, and then once you've got something that works for you and the personality you want to project, you can kind of stick it in your design system or whatever else for the rest of your team to use. So one of my favorite things about exploring this type of stuff is you can figure it out once and then just reuse it a whole lot, which is pretty cool and very nicely modular in that sense. You don't have to do this for every single animation you ever make, but you can spend a little time figuring it out once and then use it over and over, which makes it pretty handy. So that's a lot about animation and expressiveness. Let's take a minute to talk about sound. And sound is kind of a touchy subject to bring up with web people. Actually, every time the slide comes up, I'm like, whew, hope this is okay. Because when I ask about sound, or if I suggest the idea of using sound on the web, most people respond very negatively, or at least somewhat negatively. And the response is some version of we just don't do that here. You've heard this too, you brought this up, yeah. That's where the conversation always goes. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that every website should use sound everywhere all the time. Definitely not a place we should go. But I really question our reasons for not ever considering sound anymore. With so many of the other screens we use, any of our phone things and other things, our TV things, so many of the other screens we use sound as part of their UI, and some of them do it really well. It's kind of why don't we do that? And for a long time, I think it was because we don't have the technology. But now with the web audio API and audio elements, we kind of do. We have the technology empowered to do it, but we still really hesitate and move away from it. So, and I think it becomes an even more interesting question when we think about how we're seeing more and more projects lately that aren't really our traditional screen-based interfaces, right? We have things that are voice UI, things that even get into AR and other things that suddenly are very different types of screen design and actually wouldn't work at all without sound. So I think part of the reason that we hesitate to use sound is, and a lot of our hesitation comes from this fact that, like, collectively as an industry, I think we feel like we did it really wrong before, that we've just kind of messed it up maybe in the past. You know, a lot of the times, this idea of sound gives us flashbacks to the flash sites with sound on every button, like this one. Not done. You'd have a lot of fun being in my office while I was recording this and like da 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 da, and then everyone else left. It was so weird. But like that's definitely a thing we're like, yeah, we don't do that anymore, right? Nope, definitely wouldn't. So I really could not resist this punchline, but honestly, there's a lot of differences between this Facebook example and that last gallery example. For one thing, I had to turn up the volume on this Facebook screen recording by like 150% for that sound to play loud enough for us all to hear, especially that like lower level kind of like hover sound when we are just going over those sounds. The Facebook one has 2 levels of sound, right? There's a kind of like background level of sound where we're mousing over or hovering with our thumb over each one. We're just kind of like this tick, tick, tick. And then when we actually pick the heart that we want to send to the cute puppy, it's like, yoop, and much louder. So we have those 2 levels, unlike the gallery site that was just like the same really loud wooden tick on every single time. These are also timed like more directly with my interaction. It's harder to tell in video, but they actually moved with me, with my gestures, unlike the other site that just kind of like sometimes played the sound slightly after you hovered and sometimes a little before, sometimes right on it, who knows. So there's a lot of different design decisions that were made for these sounds, despite them being kind of similar things. And this example also makes me think about how our feelings towards sound changes based on the kind of screen we're using, which I find really, really interesting. Like, we're okay with this making sound on our phone, but the idea of like even that same thing making sound on our larger screens, we get a little weird about. And I found something recently that helped me kind of explain why this is. I was reading a book called Designing Products with Sound by Amber Case and Aaron Day. And if you're familiar with Amber Case's work, she talks a lot about calm technology and like technology that doesn't demand our attention, technology that doesn't stress us out, which is almost the opposite of how we've come to think of sound. And so I was super interested to see what Amber had to say about sound. In the book, there's this really great diagram that I thought explained this whole thing of why we are more accepting of sound at different screen sizes. And essentially suggests that the bigger the display is, the less we need some sort of auditory or sound-based interface. Well, the way I kind of read it is like, hey, on these bigger screens, when we have a lot more visual space, oftentimes the things that we need to convey, the things that we need to present to people is taken care of visually, like all of it's taken care of visually, and there's very little that the sound can add to it. And maybe that's why when our screens start getting smaller, we move to like the middle-ish of that, we're a little bit more, like sound makes more sense because it has more utility. And if we think of the far end of that, it's like, oh, barely any screen, all sorts of audio. And that makes me think of like voice UIs and things like that. So like this particular figure really explained to me this reaction I get a lot of times where if you talk about sound, people are like, I wouldn't want my desktop computer making sounds in my office, which is funny for so many reasons, because like, didn't we already decide people use the web outside of their office, not on a desk? But it's interesting how that metaphor comes up with sound. So I think this helps explain why we're more accepting of sound on mobile devices and why desktops seem to be a place that we are less accepting of it. The biggest reason I hear about sound, or a reason for not using sound, is the statement that sound is annoying, which you're like, okay. But there's other things that are annoying. For example, siblings are annoying. And both those statements are true at times, but they also both make a lot of assumptions about that sound or that sibling. Anyone with siblings, you know what I mean. So I was like, okay, what makes sound annoying? Sound's annoying when it's just like not appropriate for the situation. When it's played at the wrong time, like we saw in those hovers. You're hovering and then the sound comes after, you're like, no, the connection is lost. When things are too loud, when there's a lack of any control over that sound. And all of these things, when I look at this list, I'm like, this is all stuff we could design it not to do, right? You could design solutions for all of these annoying aspects of sound. You could definitely design a way to make sure all of these things are not said about the sound that you use through basically intentional design choices. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. It's like, yeah, it can be annoying, but we could make it not annoying. So what can sound offer design? Like if we're gonna venture into this water, if we're gonna maybe consider using sound and UIs somewhere along the line, how do we know we're doing it in a way that's useful? Because things that aren't useful just kind of, well, they're not useful. So we don't want to do that. There's definitely some really strong ways to think that sound can affect design and really offer design to help make it stronger. For example, sound can really change and really accentuate the way animation is interpreted, really give it some depth and power. This is the Calm app, which is like a meditation app on your phone, where they have a mode where you are encouraged to breathe, but like breathe slowly, like we all are breathing hopefully all the time, but this is like a controlled kind of breathing. And they want you to breathe slowly in and then kind of hold your breath for a minute and then breathe slowly out. And they have both an animation and sound that goes with this. Without the sound, this is basically just a circle getting bigger and getting smaller, which, that kind of says breathe in, breathe out, fill your lungs, empty your lungs, sure. But the way they add the sound to this, and they create this tension that really like physically makes you hold your breath. You're kind of like breathing in, it's like me, and you're like, and then they hit this note that's just got a little tension, and you're like, hold my breath, and then they resolve it with that nice, and you're like, oh. And they really like embodied that physical sense of breathing in, holding all your tension, then releasing all your tension with the sound and helping you like time it super well. And it's the animation and sound together that really make this work. Just one or just the other wouldn't be as effective. And this, of course, is not the only breathe thing out there. There's stuff that comes with your watch, there's stuff with other apps, but this is the one that for me I found like is most effective because they use those two things together. They're trying to get you to feel calmer, to like change the rhythm of your breath, and sound and animation are really great way to pull that off. And especially in the kind of sound they use where they like build that tension and then let it release, which is exactly what you're doing. Animation can also help create like an environment or cinematic effect, which of course is not necessarily every single site out there, but if you want to create dramatic effects, sounds are a great way to do it. For example, this phone site. Pretty dramatic. Also, this phone is from outer space. I know, because of that metallic sound it made. It was all the triangles were like kind of swooping into position to make this, and then it exploded out of it like some big gravitational thing just blew up. And it really tells a story about this phone with the way they designed this and took really great care for the sound design. Clearly, the studio that did this actually has employees like full-time sound designers who probably do like cinematic events. But the way that they've created like that kind of baseline, like almost vibration-y thing, you're in space, it's like, and they had the little interaction sounds were more like high and kind of like metallic feeling, and they really pulled this all together and made it really effective with the sound. If you view this site with no sound on, you're like, cool, exploding triangles. Ugh. With sound, you're like, space phone. I might be, I'm just summarizing maybe a little bit too much, but it's really something that can make a huge difference when we want to tell a story about a product. And there's a lot of sites out there that do great things with motion and design and have no sound and feel like they're missing a thing. One other thing I really like about this particular site and a lot of sites like them that I think is important to point out, at least in this particular point in time, this is the kind of thing that like back in the day, kind of when Jen was going through the history of like how we laid stuff out on the web, this was the sort of stuff that we would do in the Flash days. It was only possible with Flash. If you didn't have a plugin, you couldn't do this. Now this is all stuff that's done like in the browser with browser stuff. This is done with like WebGL, web audio, and JavaScript animation. It's all stuff that's like truly part of the browser. It's things that we could like make accessible, we could progressively enhance, we can make responsive, all of this stuff. It is possible with these like more true to the browser technologies, which I think makes it even more like impressive. You're like, you can view source on this. Ah! That's how I spend my weekends, just viewing source and shaking. That's not what you do? Weird. So on top of all of those, besides that emotional connection and that kind of, like both in a grander scale and smaller scale of adding that power to the animation, sound can also be a powerful brand differentiator. And we can test this out to see if it works with this next little bit. So imagine if you heard this sound. Anyone know what that is? I can tell from the slight chuckles and like the eyes down to the computer, like, did I just get a message? Yep, Slack. You hear that all the time, and we like associate it. You're like, oh, work is calling. We have other ones like this one. Oops, I hit the answer too fast, but you already knew that. You just sent some things. More work. We're getting so much done in this talk. But these are sounds that are like, they're very short, they're very succinct, but they're also very original. We connect these sounds to those specific actions and to those specific brands and products. They are what the sound designers call ear cons. Not a word I made up. I like making up words. Cannot take credit for this. This is a real word, ear cons. It's like icons for your ears. That's actually how they describe it. I love it. And these are just like icons, just like visual, like icons are kind of like a little visual package, right? And ear cons are an auditory little package. And they're something that, they're used to mark specific brand interactions and specific brands. Most products that use a lot of these will have like kind of a suite of them, a whole family of them. If you ever, actually, I was gonna say if you're bored on the internet, but really this is super interesting. So even if you're not bored on the internet, there's all sorts of YouTube videos that will play you all the Windows sounds, the Windows like OS sounds, from like 97 through now, and to see the common themes and how they're very similar sounds, but they change over the years is super interesting. So when they're done right, ear cons can lower the cognitive load on the user and like create this association, this like audio first medium where you know what's happening without even having to look at stuff. And interestingly enough, this is another strange thing to bring up on stage at a design conference, but one of the best like systems of ear cons I've ever seen is on the BlackBerry site. Haven't heard about them for a while, right? And BlackBerry actually had this whole like design system essentially around their ear cons, exactly when they were played, what notes they would hit, how long they would be, the intervals they would use, and what they would convey based on all of those to make this whole system of sounds based on these tasks and notifications, which is super, super interesting. It's still there. This is one of those parts of the internet I expect to disappear every time I go to it. I'm like, I hope it's still there. It's still there. And it's super, super interesting read. If you're interested in this idea of ear cons or sound and UI, this is a great place to kind of get a sense of how they can be a system together. So the kinds of things, that's the kinds of things that sound can offer design on a high level, but what about the more specific stuff? So some of the specific things is we can use sound for alerts and notifications. The stuff we might, just like that Slack sound and the Outlook sound, the things where we're probably looking elsewhere, we've probably moved on to our next thing, but we do want to have that confirmation or that notification that things are happening. And these can be really effective, so you don't have to keep checking stuff. You can go on to do what you were doing, not have to keep checking, like, did I get a Slack message? Did my email send? None of that stuff is what you have to worry about. And these can vary quite a bit, even though they have the same goal. Like, we'll hear things like this. It's Facebook notification. You all just got Facebook messages, or did you? Time for a meeting. And dinner is done. Or at least that's how my dog understands the sound. Whoops. That's a whole other thing, though, of pets and how they've learned what sounds mean. But all of those are alert sounds, right? And the Facebook one is like very kind of muted and just sort of like da-dump, and it's kind of like a gentle nudge, because Facebook messages, the sound fits it very well. You probably want to know, but maybe you're also like working on something else or actually at work, and it's more of like a soft social kind of thing. And Facebook sounds all have that little kind of muted feel to them. The Outlook meeting reminder one's a little bit more open-ended, right? It kind of has a bigger crescendo to it, and it's a little bit more of like, hey, do a thing is coming up. The last one is the Alexa timer, which is probably the most demanding of our attention, right? It's like dun 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 dun, come on, and that's the only one that she doesn't say that. But that's the only one that demands your immediate attention, right? You can let your Facebook message wait. You can probably let your calendar reminder wait, depending on how long you have to that meeting. But the Alexa timer is like, hey, you wanted a timer, something's happening, it might be burning, you should probably come down and take care of this. So they have a similar purpose, but a very different feel based on the kind of response that they want. We can use sound to navigate space and kind of get a sense of where we are, which I think can be a really useful thing when we have so many situations where we have an interface that you can't see entirely on screen, or you're going to different places and want to connect those. Apple TV does this really well, where they have this kind of, you're kind of zooming in and out of levels between your Apple TV, your sort of menu level, and your more specific detail level, and they have a sound that goes really well with it. Like both the movement and the sound kind of make you think of this sort of like comb where you're just like whoop, going up and then whoop, going down. And it works out so well, it's so perfect. And you get that sense of changing levels both in the sound and the motion, and really helps connect and put that together for you that you're going to a different place of your Apple TV navigation situation. We can also use them to confirm actions. We can just let you know that a thing really did work. And we see this a lot with things like, with things like purchasing stuff, like with Touch ID, which is, one thing, and the button's like not a real physical button, but they add this little sound when you're done paying for things. And that can make it much more satisfying, right? It's also a very very kind of hard tactile sound. It's like, da-ding, you made a thing happen. And you maybe bought some more meditation apps, apparently, is what I bought. What does that say about me? Don't know. We also see this on stuff like Twitter, where you're pulling to refresh. This one's a little bit quiet, but I'm sure you've seen this before too. Where it's kind of like you get that really scratchy feel. It's like as you're pulling, and then if more tweets come up, it's like pop, gives you that little pop. They've just popped into view, and there's more things for you to read obsessively. It really gives it that kind of tactile feel to what you're doing, which I've noticed a lot of at least the UI sounds, especially on like touch-based things that feel the most realistic or kind of really feel like they fit the best, tend to have that little bit of grittiness to them. It's almost like they're making up for the lack of texture on the actual glass surface, which is a whole other place to go. So we can also use sound to mark some positive moments, which is a great way to when you have these things where you want to celebrate a good thing happening. I find that a lot of the products I use don't always take advantage of celebrating this. You're like, a thing got done, I'm so happy. And the app's just like, whatever. Clear is a to-do app from a while back, but they do the opposite of that. They celebrate these happy moments very, very much. When you're checking things off your extremely important to-do list like this one, here's what it does. So it's like, it really builds, right? It's like, you got one done. He's like, da-da, da-da, da-da. Like, yay, you got them all done. Or not all of them yet, but it keeps going, each one of these crescendos. And then when you're really done, so they build the tension, right? Each one you get down, they're like, yes, 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 yes. And then they're like, bye, to-do list. You are free to do whatever you want. And the way they use sound for this makes it really rewards those moments and makes this just much more of a pleasure to knock things off your to-do list. So let's look at, what are our best practices for UI sound? If we looked at some places where sound can be useful for design, how we can design it to be useful and, add something to what's going on, add something to the experience, as well as conveying this idea of what our brand is all about. What are some good things to keep in mind while we're doing it? First thing is that UI sounds are really short. I think the only sound that could be considered long that we've listened to this entire time was that Alexa timer, because it repeated multiple times until you turn it off. Most of these are super short. I'm talking like 200, 400 milliseconds tops. Very, very short sounds. It doesn't take we don't need a lot of sound to convey these things. This short length of time of sound also means they're very, very small files. Even a really complex 400 millisecond sound can be single-digit Ks in size. Ending on an ascending, reading words is hard. Ending on an ascending interval can be positive. The Clear one did that, where it was like, da-da, 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 da-da. It keeps getting higher and higher. It's like, this is better, this is better. So going up in your interval tends to feel more positive, or the beginning of something, like opening something up, as opposed to going downward in your interval and closing it. If any of you have taken years and years of piano lessons like I did back when I was a kid, suddenly it is relevant to your job. You should thank your parents. Ending on a descending interval, notes that go down, can be more for negative feedback or ending things. If the idea of intervals and stuff is something you're not familiar with, those of you that didn't take all those piano lessons as kids, now Google will just play all this stuff for you. You're just like, Google, play me an ascending interval, and it will. It's like, all that time I wasted, I should have just waited for search engines. And when we use things like giving the user control to stop, start, and customize, even that Slack sound that is very much a Slack earcon, you can adjust your Slack sounds, you can turn them off, you can pick different sounds. They have that default one that is theirs that they've kind of claimed as their earcon, but you have these controls to customize. And I feel like pretty much every app or every site that I run into that has sound that I'm like, ooh, that was good, they also have some level of control for you as the user to decide how these are going to work for you. They may not all be so far as letting you customize the sound itself, because Slack you're using every day, all day. That's very different from like a website or a thing you might use for just a few minutes at a time. So the amount of control depends on what's getting done, but they all have some level of control. There's even some really interesting research out there and some books about like the emotional effects of intervals, which I think is super interesting, and where we have this idea of like consonant intervals, which kind of create that sense of pleasant, positive things. Dissonant intervals, which is like what we heard with that calm one, where it just kind of raised this dissonant place and then released to this more consonant interval. So mixing them up to create these different emotions and these different feelings. Large intervals are often feeling very powerful, because the way I like to think about it is if you're going to play a large interval on a piano, you're like doing this, which obviously looks really more powerful than just like hitting keys close together, because you have to stretch, so you look bigger and more powerful. And things like octaves can be very lighthearted as well. So that would be our consonant interval, and that's like our dissonant interval. You can kind of hear the difference, like one's a little tense and one's very consonant. This is also being done with a GarageBand piano, which I highly do not recommend for any of your UI sounds, in case that wasn't convincing. And our octaves can feel very lighthearted because they're very nice and even, and they have that big stretch. It's like pretty and light, right? You're just like, yay, octaves. Or maybe that's just me. That's cool. So if we want to make sound happen on the web, we've got some pretty cool ways to do it. You can actually make it like with your browser. With the web audio API, you can make your own oscillators, change the frequency, all these different types of oscillators. This is a Google experiment that makes each of these oscillators a character, which is like clearly the best one. If you think of them as cute little characters, it's so much more easier to work with. So we can like generate our own sounds with the browser if we want to. That's one way to do it. To have kind of maybe less of a blank page starting point for sound, we can use some of these libraries that people have put out for us. This one is Octave, which is technically made more for like iOS UI sounds. This one's a free one. They have a bunch that are designed more specifically to fit with iOS things, but you can use them for other things, because they just come as MP3 files, sound files that we can use however we want. These ones are made like by developers for developers kind of thing. There's also sites like Motion Sound.io, which is a source of sound made by sound designers for motion designers. So they have various different packs. Some of them are for like when you're making your movie trailer. You could get that pack. Probably not going to be useful though. But they do have a pack all around digital, and these are all like professionally designed sounds, like bleeps and bloops. And one of the things that I really like is they have these families of sounds. Like they have a collection of like blue beep sounds, and you're like, oh, what are the difference there? And you can kind of like get a sense for what those differences are. So they have sounds like these ones, and then in that same family, there's this one. So all sorts of different beeps and stuff, and some of them are a little bit shorter and less dramatic as well, but a great range of things. I found this pack really interesting to like kind of study the differences of too. So one last thing I wanted to talk about before we all go off to make sounds and animations for ourselves is, we focus this all around expressing a specific personality, but there can be cases where maybe you don't know what the specific personality of your product is. Some people do, some people don't, and having that, agreement on what it is you're trying to say and saying it with all your design choices is really what makes this stuff most effective. All those examples we looked at the very beginning, they didn't just do expressing their personality with one thing. They didn't do it with just color or just type or just animation. They did it by using all the things together. All the design things they used added up to the same message. So if you're looking to find your personality, the personality of your brand or product, there's some kind of like quick key takeaways to start you off on that journey. When you're defining a personality, I think the kinds of things you want to ask yourself are things like, what are we trying to help people accomplish? I find it's really useful to imagine your brand as a person. What kind of person would it be? And that can be some fun things to answer. What is it like? What's its mood? What's its disposition? There's many different moods and dispositions you can have. Even if your product is doing something that many other products do, you don't have to have the same mood or disposition that they do. And if you know what yours is, you can convey that with your design. What does it know? Is it a super smart, know-it-all product? Is it a helpful, maybe still learning with you kind of product? There's so many personalities we can have for our products. Some great ways to find those out. I've done some successful workshops in the past with cards like the brand deck, which you essentially have these different cards with different adjectives and personality traits on them, and you make a list with a group of people, narrowing down which ones you are and which ones you aren't, and it can get super interesting to see different people's interpretation of the thing that you work on. Talking to your customers is a really great way to do this too. I pointed this out in the beginning that one of the things that makes the most effective personalities really connect is the fact that they fit, you as the person using it, they fit your model of what that personality and what that product should be. If people perceive you as being very down to earth and very approachable, you can't really successfully try to pull off being super slick and really looking down on people. It has to kind of match what people think of you already. And 2 books that are have some exercises that can get you started on figuring out even in more detail what your personality is and how to express it is Designing for Emotion, which you will actually see the author of this book up here on stage a little bit later, tomorrow, and Conversational Design by Erica Hall. Both of these have different exercises you can go through to start honing in what your brand personality is. They take a couple different approaches and get you to that same end result of what are we about? They have some really great ways you can get through to that end goal. So I encourage you all to think about the wide variety of design tools we have to work with and how we can make those express specific things and express things together as a joint effort. You don't have to use them all, definitely don't have to. You can use a subset of them or whatever you want. And I think the key is being intentional about what you want your design to say and how you say it. And that's how we can make these products that really stand out, express one clear message. And they're even the kind of projects that I think really make the landscape of what we make more interesting and more interesting to use and build, so on both accounts. So if you wanted to dig more into animation stuff, I wrote a book about it. This digs into a lot of the animation things. I also have a newsletter where I can remind you how cool animation is every Friday. If you want me to, I will do that for you because you are all very cool. And with that, thanks so much for listening.